The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Charleston County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Michael Pearson adjusted his black robe as he prepared for another routine day in traffic court. At 52 years old, with graying temples and stern blue eyes, he had earned a reputation for being strict but fair in his rulings. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. Court clerks shuffled papers, lawyers whispered to their clients, and nervous defendants shifted in their seats. Judge Pearson had seen thousands of faces come through his courtroom over the past 15 years, but today would be different, though he didn't know it yet. Case number 2347, Shanice Thompson, called out the court clerk, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. A young black woman in her early 30s walked forward. She wore a neat navy blue dress and carried herself with quiet dignity. As she approached the podium, Judge Pearson felt an odd sensation wash over him. Something about her face, the shape of her eyes, the way she held her chin, struck a familiar chord deep within his memory. "Miss Thompson," Judge Pearson began, consulting the file before him, "you're here today for running a red light and failing to produce current vehicle registration. How do you plead?" Janice's voice was clear and steady. "Guilty to the red light, Your Honor, but I can explain about the registration." As she spoke, Judge Pearson found himself studying her features more intently. The resemblance to someone he knew kept nagging at him, like a word stuck on the tip of his tongue. He noticed her high cheekbones, so similar to his father's old photographs, but he quickly dismissed the thought. "Please proceed with your explanation, Miss Thompson," he said, maintaining his professional demeanor. "I had just moved back to Charleston to care for my grandmother," Janice explained. "She's been sick, and I was rushing to get her medicine that morning. I know it's no excuse for running the red light. As for the registration, I had just transferred my car from Georgia, and the new registration was still being processed." Something in the way she mentioned her grandmother made Judge Pearson lean forward slightly. "And your grandmother, she lives here in Charleston?" "Yes, Your Honor. She's lived here her whole life." "Rose Williams." "Well, she was Rose Pearson before she married my grandfather." The name hit Judge Pearson like a physical force. He gripped the edge of his desk, hoping no one noticed his sudden tension. Pearson wasn't a rare name in Charleston, he told himself, but combined with those familiar features. The courtroom seemed to grow quieter, though nothing had really changed. Judge Pearson realized he'd been silent for several seconds too long. He cleared his throat. "Miss Thompson, do you have proof of the new registration now?" Shanice nodded and handed some papers to the bailiff, who brought them to the judge. As he reviewed the documents, his mind raced with questions he couldn't ask. Not here, not now. He thought about the old family photos in his attic, especially the ones of his father in his younger days. There was something about Shanice's smile that reminded him of those yellowed photographs. "The registration appears to be in order now," he said finally. "Regarding the red light violation, while I understand the circumstances with your grandmother, we must maintain traffic safety." He paused, then continued. "I'm assigning a fine of $120, which you can pay in installments if needed." "Thank you, Your Honor," Janice replied, relief evident in her voice. As she turned to leave, Judge Pearson found himself wanting to call her back, to ask about her family, about Rose Pearson who shared his family name. But the weight of his robe and the responsibility it represented held him back. This was a courtroom, not a place for personal inquiries. "Next case," he called out, his voice slightly hoarse. But as the day continued, Judge Pearson couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. During the lunch break, he found himself pulling out his phone, typing Rose Pearson Charleston 1960s into the search bar. He stopped himself before pressing search. Some questions were better asked in person, through proper channels. But one thing was certain. He would find out the truth about Shanice Thompson and the grandmother who shared his family name. Judge Michael Pearson sat in his private chambers later that afternoon, his lunch remaining untouched on his desk. The morning's encounter with Shanice Thompson had disturbed his usual routine in ways he couldn't ignore. His computer screen glowed with an open search page, but he hadn't typed anything yet. Sarah, his secretary of 12 years, knocked on his door. "Judge, I have those old court records you asked for." "Thank you, Sarah," he said, taking the stack of yellowed folders. "And could you do me one more favor? See if you can find any information about a Rose Pearson or Rose Williams from the 1960s. She would have lived in the Charleston area. Sarah raised an eyebrow but nodded professionally. Of course, Judge. Any particular reason? Just following up on an old family matter, he replied, trying to sound casual. After Sarah left, Michael opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph he kept there. It showed his father, James Pearson, as a young man in 1965, standing proudly in front of their family's hardware store. He had always thought he knew everything about his father, a successful businessman, a strict parent, a pillar of the local community. But now, doubt crept in like morning fog off the Charleston harbor. His office phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Judge Pearson speaking. Your Honor, it's Betty from the county records office. I think I found something interesting about that Rose Pearson you asked about. There's a marriage certificate from 1966, Rose Pearson becoming Rose Williams. But there's something else? Michael's heart began to race. Go on. There's a birth certificate from early 1967. Father's name is listed as unknown, but the mother is Rose Williams, formerly Pearson. Baby girl was named Margaret. Margaret. Shanice had mentioned her mother's name during the hearing. Michael scribbled notes on his legal pad, his hands slightly shaking. Thank you, Betty. Could you send those documents to my office? After hanging up, Michael loosened his tie and walked to his office window. The Charleston streets below bustled with afternoon traffic. Somewhere out there, a whole branch of his family tree had been growing without his knowledge. His cell phone buzzed, a text from his mother. Coming for Sunday dinner this weekend? Michael stared at the message, wondering if his mother knew anything about this. She had married his father in late 1967, just months after Margaret's birth, according to the records. Did she know about Rose? About Margaret? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sarah entered with a manila envelope. Judge, I found something. Several old newspaper clippings and a photograph from the Charleston Daily in 1965. Michael opened the envelope with careful fingers. The first clipping showed a community picnic, and there in the background, he saw his father standing next to a beautiful young black woman. They weren't looking at the camera, but at each other, their expressions holding something that couldn't be mistaken, love. He spread the materials across his desk, the photograph of his father, the newspaper clipping, the marriage records Betty had mentioned. Pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed began fitting together. Sarah, he called out, could you get me Ms. Thompson's contact information from this morning's court records? Judge, you know that might not be appropriate. You're right, he sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. But I need to know the truth. Instead of calling Shanice directly, Michael decided to write a letter. He spent the next hour carefully choosing his words. Dear Ms. Thompson, I hope you'll forgive this unusual correspondence from the judge who heard your traffic case. During the hearing, you mentioned your grandmother, Rose Pearson Williams. I have reason to believe we may share a family connection. He paused, then added his personal phone number at the bottom of the letter. As he sealed the envelope, Michael thought about how one simple traffic violation had started unraveling decades of family secrets. That evening, as he drove home through the historic streets of Charleston, Michael couldn't help but notice how many of the old buildings held secrets behind their graceful facades. His family, it seemed, was no different. Tomorrow, he would begin a deeper search into the past, but for now, he had taken the first step toward uncovering the truth about Rose Pearson and the family he never knew he had. The weekend arrived with the weight of unanswered questions. Judge Michael Pearson stood in his attic, surrounded by dusty boxes and old memories. He had told his wife Linda he needed to organize some old files, but in truth, he was searching for anything that might tell them more about Rose Williams and his father's past. Michael, Linda's voice called from downstairs. Your mother's on the phone. He climbed down from the attic, his shirt dusty and his mind racing. Taking the phone, he heard his mother's familiar voice. Michael, dear, are you still coming for Sunday dinner tomorrow? Actually, Mom, he paused, gathering his courage. I need to ask you something important. Did you ever hear Dad mention someone named Rose Williams? Or Rose Pearson? The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Michael thought the call had dropped. Then he heard his mother take a shaky breath. How did you find out about Rose? She asked quietly. Michael sat down heavily in his kitchen chair. So you knew? Sit down with me tomorrow, his mother said. There's a lot you need to know. The next day, Michael arrived at his mother's house earlier than usual. Eleanor Pearson, now 78, waited for him on her porch swing, a worn leather photo album in her lap. Her white hair was neatly styled as always, but her hands trembled slightly as she patted the seat beside her. "Your father wasn't perfect, Michael," she began, opening the album. "But he was a good man who lived in complicated times." She turned to a page showing a younger James Pearson standing in front of the family hardware store. Next to him stood a beautiful black woman, Rose, both of them smiling despite the careful distance between them in the photograph. "They met at the store," Eleanor explained. "Rose came in looking for work in 1964. Your father hired her to keep the books, even though some customers complained. She was smart, kind, and they fell in love." Michael stared at the photo, seeing his father's happiness clearly for the first time. "What happened?" "James's father, your grandfather, found out. He threatened to disown James and take away the store if he didn't end things with Rose. She was already pregnant by then." Eleanor wiped a tear from her eye. "Your father tried to stand up to him, but Rose made the decision herself. She left town, saying she wouldn't let James lose everything he worked for." "But she came back," Michael said, thinking of the records he'd found. Eleanor nodded. "She returned a few months later, married to Thomas Williams, a good man who raised Margaret as his own daughter. Your father made sure they never wanted for anything, but quietly, through a lawyer. It was his way of taking responsibility without disrupting anyone's lives." Michael thought of Shanice in his courtroom, of the familiar features he recognized without understanding why. "Did you know about Margaret? About her daughter?" "I knew about Margaret. James told me everything before we married, but I didn't know she had a daughter." Eleanor touched the photograph gently. "Rose was a remarkable woman. She sacrificed her own happiness to protect everyone around her. James never forgave himself for not being braver." Standing up, Eleanor walked inside and returned with a small wooden box. "Your father left this for you. I was supposed to give it to you if you ever asked about Rose." Inside the box, Michael found letters, photos, and a handwritten note from his father. "Dear Michael, if you're reading this, you've discovered a part of our family history I should have told you about long ago. Rose Williams was the love of my life, and Margaret is your half-sister. I failed them both by choosing security over courage. Don't make the same mistake. The world is different now. Better, I hope. Make this right in a way I never could. Love, Dad." Michael sat on the porch for a long time, reading through the letters that told a story of love, sacrifice, and regret. His father had passed away 5 years ago, never knowing his granddaughter Shanice had grown up to be a strong, accomplished woman. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his mother's garden, Michael made a decision. He would reach out to Rose, Margaret, and Shanice. It was time to heal this decades-old wound in their family tree. "Mom," he said finally, "I need your help with something." Eleanor smiled, understanding in her eyes. "It's time, isn't it?" "Yes," Michael replied. "It's time to bring our family together." A week after his mother's revelations, Judge Michael Pearson sat in his car outside a small blue house on the east side of Charleston. The letter he had sent to Shanice Thompson had received a quick response, and now he found himself invited to Sunday dinner with the family he never knew he had. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Next to him sat a box of old photographs and letters, evidence of a past that connected them all. After taking several deep breaths, he finally stepped out of the car. Before he could reach the front porch, the door opened. Shanice stood there, wearing a casual sundress instead of the formal attire from court. Behind her stood an older woman in her 60s. Margaret, his half-sister, and seated in a comfortable chair near the window was Rose Williams herself, now in her early 80s but still carrying herself with remarkable dignity. "Judge Pearson," Shanice said softly, "please come in." "Please call me Michael," he replied, his voice slightly shaky. "I'm not here as a judge today." The living room was warm and welcoming, filled with family photos and comfortable furniture. Michael couldn't help but notice a familiar face in some of the older pictures, his father, James Pearson, watching from the background at what appeared to be Margaret's high school graduation. "You came to all my important events," Margaret said, following his gaze. "Always stayed in the background, but he was there." Rose Williams adjusted her glasses, studying Michael's face. "You look just like him," she said quietly. "Say nice." Same way of holding yourself. Michael sat down, placing the box on the coffee table. I brought some things you might want to see, and I have so many questions if you're willing to answer them. First, Rose said, her voice strong despite her age, you should know that none of us blamed James. Those were different times, hard times. We all did what we had to do to survive. Margaret brought out a photo album of her own. Mom kept everything, she explained, opening it to show Michael pictures of her childhood. Every birthday card your father sent, every Christmas gift. He made sure I went to college, though everyone thought it was a scholarship fund. Did you ever want to reach out? Michael asked, looking at his half-sister's face, now seeing the clear family resemblance. Many times, Margaret admitted, but it seemed kinder to let sleeping dogs lie, until Shanice ended up in your courtroom. She smiled at her daughter. Sometimes fate has its own plans. Shanice brought out coffee and cake, and as they sat together, the stories began to flow. Rose told Michael about falling in love with his father, about their secret meetings in the park, and about the difficult choice she made to protect everyone involved. Your grandfather was a powerful man, Rose explained. He would have destroyed your father's life, and mine too. Sometimes love means letting go. Michael learned that Margaret had become a successful teacher, that Shanice was working on her master's degree in social work, and that Rose had run her own seamstress business for 40 years. They were accomplished, strong women who had built beautiful lives despite the challenges they faced. There's something else you should know, Margaret said, reaching for her purse. She pulled out a letter, dated just 3 months before James Pearson's death. Your father wrote to me. He wanted to meet, to explain everything himself, but he got sick before we could arrange it. Michael read the letter, his vision blurring with tears as he recognized his father's handwriting. My dear Margaret, I've watched you grow from afar, proud of every achievement, aching to be part of your life. Your mother made the brave choice I couldn't, and you've grown into an amazing woman. I hope someday you can forgive me, and I hope someday our families can know each other as they should. Love, your father. Looking up from the letter, Michael saw 3 generations of strong women who shared his blood, who had lived parallel lives to his own family for decades. The weight of lost time pressed heavily on his heart, but he also felt hope for the future they could build together. I can't change the past, he said finally, but I'd like to be part of your lives now, if you'll let me. Rose reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Family is family, she said simply. It's never too late to come home. The next morning, Judge Michael Pearson sat in his chambers an hour before court was scheduled to begin. His desk, usually neat and organized, was covered with family photographs, old ones from his father's box, new ones from yesterday's dinner with Rose, Margaret, and Shanice. The contrast between his 2 families' lives over the decades struck him hard. He picked up a photo of his childhood home, a large, colonial-style house in the wealthy part of Charleston. Next to it, he placed a picture Margaret had shared of her childhood apartment above a small store. Both children had smiled in their photos, but their lives had been worlds apart. Sarah, his secretary, knocked gently on the door. Judge, your wife is here. Linda Pearson walked in, concern written across her face. Michael had returned home late last night, too emotional to explain where he'd been. Now, looking at his wife of 30 years, he didn't know where to begin. I met them yesterday, he said finally, gesturing to the photos. My sister, my niece, Rose. Linda sat down quietly, picking up one of the photographs. Tell me about them, she said simply. As Michael shared the story, his voice cracked several times. He told her about Rose's quiet strength, about Margaret's successful career as a teacher despite having fewer opportunities than he had, about Shanice's determination to help others through social work. All these years, he said, I lived in privilege while they faced struggles I never had to think about. My father's choice gave me advantages that Margaret never had. You can't blame yourself for circumstances you didn't create, Linda replied gently. Can't I? Michael stood up, pacing his office. I've been a judge for 15 years. How many times have I passed judgment on people without understanding their full stories? How many times have my own hidden biases affected my decisions? He stopped at the window, looking out at the courthouse square where protesters often gathered to demand justice reform. He'd always viewed them with professional detachment. Now, he wondered about their stories, their families, their struggles. Linda walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "What are you going to do?" Before Michael could answer, Sarah appeared again. "Judge, I have your cases for today. There's also a message from the Bar Association. They're looking for speakers for their diversity and inclusion panel next month." Michael looked at the court calendar, then back at the family photos. "Sarah, please clear my afternoon schedule and tell the Bar Association I'd like to speak at their panel." He turned to his wife. "I need to make some changes." Over lunch, Michael met with his court clerk, Jason. "I want to review my sentencing patterns from the past 5 years. Everything, traffic violations, misdemeanors, all of it. Break it down by demographics." "That's a lot of data, Judge," Jason said, looking surprised. "May I ask why?" "Because we can't fix what we don't acknowledge," Michael replied. "And I need to acknowledge my own biases before I can address them." That evening, Michael drove to the east side of town, to the community center where Shaughnessy volunteered. He found her leading a youth group discussion about navigating the legal system. "Uncle Michael," she said, surprising him with the familiar term. "Would you like to join us?" For the next hour, Michael listened as young people shared their experiences with law enforcement and the courts. Their stories hit him differently now, not as a judge, but as someone who finally understood the weight of systemic inequalities. After the session, Shanice walked with him to his car. "Mom, Margaret. She's organizing a family dinner this Sunday. She's invited your mother too. And Linda, if she'd like to come." Michael felt tears prick at his eyes. "We'll be there." Driving home through Charleston's historic streets, Michael saw the city with new eyes. The grand old houses no longer seemed just beautiful. They stood as reminders of a complicated history that had shaped all their lives. But in his heart, alongside the guilt and regret, he felt something new growing: hope. He pulled out his phone and called his court administrator. "Janet, I want to start a mentorship program for minority law students, and I need to make some changes to our community outreach initiatives." Change wouldn't happen overnight, but Michael knew where to begin. It would start with him, with his courtroom, with his family, both sides of it. The truth had shaken his world, but from that shaking, something better could grow. The following week brought changes to Judge Michael Pearson's life that he never expected. His mother, Eleanor, had suggested hosting a proper family dinner at her house, a gesture that surprised everyone. The grand old Pearson family home would finally welcome all branches of the family tree. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Michael asked, helping her prepare the dining room. "It's not too much too soon?" Eleanor posed while polishing her best silver. "I've waited 30 years to make this right, Michael. That's too long already." The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows as Eleanor and Linda, Michael's wife, moved around the kitchen preparing dinner. The doorbell rang precisely at 5 o'clock. Rose Williams stood at the door, elegant in a blue dress, supported by Margaret on one side and Shanice on the other. For a moment, everyone froze, the weight of history heavy in the air. Then Eleanor stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Welcome home," she said simply, embracing Rose. "I've waited so long to meet you." The two older women looked at each other, seeing the shadows of their younger selves. Two women who had loved the same man, whose lives had been shaped by the choices of their time. "Your husband spoke of you often," Rose said softly to Eleanor. "He said you had a kind heart. Now I see he was right." In the living room, Margaret walked slowly, looking at the family photos on the walls. She stopped at one of James Pearson. "I have this same picture," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He sent it to me when I graduated college." Michael watched as his wife Linda approached Margaret. "Would you like to see some other family albums? There might be photos you've never seen." As the two women sat together on the sofa, Linda brought out old photo albums. Janice joined them, asking questions about each picture, building bridges between past and present. In the kitchen, Eleanor and Rose worked side by side, finishing dinner preparations. Their quiet conversation drifted out, stories of James, of raising children, of lives lived parallel but apart. "He never stopped loving you," Eleanor told Rose. "I knew that, and I accepted it. Love isn't always simple. And I never stopped being grateful to you," Rose replied. "You gave him happiness when I couldn't." Michael felt overwhelmed by the simple beauty of seeing his family finally together. He stepped onto the back porch, needing a moment to collect himself. Shanice followed him out. Uncle Michael, she said, Mom found something she wants to show you. They went back inside, where Margaret held out an envelope. Inside was a letter, dated just weeks before James Pearson's death, that he had never sent. Dear family, I've lived a life split in two, blessed with love twice, accursed by the times that kept my family apart. My greatest regret is not fighting harder to bring you all together. Love shouldn't have to hide in shadows. Eleanor, you've shown more grace than I deserved. Rose, you gave me more love than I earned. Margaret, watching you grow up from afar broke my heart daily. Michael, I hope someday you'll understand and finish what I couldn't, bringing our family together. With all my love, James. The room fell quiet as Michael read the letter aloud. Then Eleanor spoke up, her voice strong and clear. Well, James got his wish. We're all here now. To new beginnings, Rose added, raising her water glass. As they gathered around the dinner table, Eleanor, Rose, Margaret, Shanice, Michael, and Linda, the years of separation seemed to melt away. They shared stories, passed dishes, and began the delicate work of becoming a true family. Next week, Shanice announced, I'm speaking at a community forum about family reconciliation. Would you all come? We'll be there, Michael said, looking around the table at the faces of his expanded family. All of us. As the evening drew to a close, Michael watched his mother and Rose embrace again, this time without hesitation. Sometimes, he realized, the bravest thing wasn't making the first move, but accepting the hand when it was finally extended. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was theirs to shape together. 2 weeks after the dinner at Eleanor's house, Judge Michael Pearson stood nervously in the Charleston Community Center's main hall. The space had been transformed for a special event, a family reunion that would bring together not just the immediate Pearson family, but dozens of extended relatives from both sides of the family tree. Rose had discovered that her late husband, Thomas Williams, had cousins spread across 3 states. Meanwhile, Eleanor had contacted Pearson relatives from Virginia to Florida. Today, they would all meet for the first time. Are you ready for this? Linda asked, squeezing her husband's hand as people began arriving. The hall slowly filled with faces, some familiar, others new, but all connected by blood or marriage to the Pearson-Williams family. Children ran between tables decorated with fresh flowers, while older relatives gathered in small groups, sharing stories and discovering connections. Margaret approached Michael, holding an old photo album. Look what I found in Mom's attic, she said, opening it to reveal pictures of their father's hardware store from the 1960s. There's so much history here. As they looked through the album together, an elderly man approached them. It was Uncle Robert, their father's younger brother, who had flown in from Virginia. I remember that store, he said softly, looking at the photos. I remember Rose, too. He turned to Margaret. I always wanted to reach out, but James made me promise to protect the secret. I'm sorry we wasted so many years. Rose, sitting in a comfortable chair like a queen holding court, was surrounded by young relatives eager to hear her stories. She pointed to different faces in old photographs, connecting the dots between families. Your grandfather Thomas, she told a young cousin, was the bravest man I ever knew. He gave his name and his love to a child that wasn't his, and never once made me feel ashamed. Shanice had organized activities to help everyone get to know each other. She set up a family tree wall where people could add their names and photos, creating a visual representation of their connected histories. Look at this, she said to Michael, pointing to the growing tree. We're not just healing our immediate family, we're healing generations of separation. Eleanor moved through the crowd with a grace that surprised everyone. She had prepared name tags with both family names, Pearson Williams, symbolizing the unity they were building. James would be so proud, she whispered to Rose as they watched their grandchildren playing together. The afternoon brought more surprises. Cousins discovered shared interests and similar mannerisms. 2 teenagers, one from each side of the family, realized they attended the same high school. A Williams nephew and a Pearson niece were both studying law, inspired by different parts of the same family story. Michael stood to address the gathering, his voice thick with emotion. Today, we're not just reuniting a family, he said. We're showing our community that love can bridge any divide. The mistakes of the past don't have to determine our future. Margaret joined him at the microphone. Our father couldn't bring us together in his lifetime, she added, but his love for all of us planted the seeds for this day. As the afternoon turned to evening, people shared meals, swapped phone numbers, and made plans for future gatherings. The children had already formed their own bonds, oblivious to the complex history that had kept their parents apart. A local newspaper photographer, invited to document the historic reunion, captured a powerful image. Rose and Eleanor, sitting together, surrounded by 4 generations of their blended family. The photo would later become a symbol of hope and reconciliation in their community. "This isn't just our story anymore," Janice told her uncle as they watched people saying goodbye. "It belongs to everyone who needs to believe that healing is possible." As the last guests departed, Michael looked around the hall at the remnants of their celebration, the family tree wall now full of names and faces, the empty plates that had held shared meals, the chairs where stories had been exchanged and bonds formed. Rose called him over. "Michael," she said, taking his hand, "your father's love created 2 families, but it's your courage that finally made us one." The truth of her words settled over him like a blessing. They had done more than reunite a family. They had shown their community that love could triumph over prejudice, and that it's never too late to right the wrongs of the past. 1 year had passed since the traffic violation that brought the Pearson-Williams family together. The Charleston County Courthouse looked different now, not just because of the physical changes, but because of the new spirit that filled its halls. Judge Michael Pearson sat in his chambers, reviewing the latest reports from the mentorship program he had started. Photos on his desk now showed his complete family: Eleanor and Rose at Christmas dinner, Janice's graduate school graduation, Margaret's classroom where she now taught social justice alongside English literature. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Janice entered, wearing a crisp business suit. She wasn't here as his niece today, but as a representative of the Charleston Social Justice Initiative, where she now worked full-time. "Uncle Michael," she said, setting down a thick folder, "the first year's results are in. Your changes to the court's community outreach program have made a real difference." Together, they reviewed the numbers. Traffic fine payment plans had helped hundreds of low-income families avoid deeper legal troubles. The new mentorship program had connected 50 minority students with legal professionals. The courthouse's free legal clinic, staffed by volunteer lawyers, had helped over 200 families navigate the justice system. "Your father would be proud," said a voice from the doorway. Rose stood there, looking elegant as always, with Margaret beside her. "Mom insisted on coming to see your new initiatives in action," Margaret explained, helping Rose to a chair. At 83, Rose had become a regular presence at the courthouse. She volunteered twice a week, helping people fill out legal forms and offering encouragement to nervous defendants. The courthouse staff had come to call her Mama Rose, and her presence brought warmth to the imposing building. "I have some news," Michael said, standing up. "The state Supreme Court has approved our family court reform proposal. Starting next month, all judges in South Carolina will receive mandatory training on implicit bias and cultural competency." Rose smiled. "James started with one job offer in his hardware store. You're changing the whole system." Eleanor arrived next, carrying lunch for everyone. These impromptu family gatherings in Michael's chambers had become a regular occurrence. The courthouse staff had grown used to seeing all generations of the Pearson-Williams family together. "Linda called," Eleanor announced. "She's finished setting up the scholarship foundation." The James Pearson Memorial Scholarship, funded by both sides of the family, would help minority students pursue careers in law or social justice. The first recipients would be announced next month. "Speaking of announcements," Janice said, "I've been invited to speak at the National Conference on Family Reconciliation. They want to hear our story." Michael looked around his chambers at these strong women who had changed his life. "Our story is still being written," he said. "Every day we help another family heal, we add another chapter." Later that afternoon, Michael presided over a special session of court. Instead of hearing cases, he was swearing in new volunteer mediators for the Community Dispute Resolution Program. Among them was Margaret, who had taken special training to help families work through conflicts. "Remember," he told the volunteers, "every person who comes through these doors has a story. Our job is to listen and help them find a path to justice that heals rather than punishes." After the ceremony, the family gathered at Rose's house for dinner, a weekly tradition now. The small blue house had become the heart of their blended family, its walls echoing with laughter and conversation in a way that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. As they sat around Rose's dining table, Michael looked at the faces of his family. Eleanor and Rose shared recipes and grandchildren's stories. Margaret and Linda discussed plans for expanding the mentorship program. Shanice showed everyone the draft of her conference speech. "You know what your father used to say?" Rose asked, passing the cornbread to Michael. "He said that love always finds a way." He was right. It just took a little longer than he hoped. "And a traffic ticket," Shanice added with a laugh. "And a judge who was willing to look beyond the bench," Margaret finished. Michael smiled, feeling the warmth of his complete family around him. They had transformed a painful secret into a source of healing not just for themselves, but for their entire community. Their story had become a beacon of hope, showing that it's never too late for justice, never too late for healing, never too late for love. As the sun set over Charleston, casting long shadows through Rose's windows, the Pearson-Williams family continued writing their story, not in the courtroom now, but in the hearts they touched and the lives they changed, one day at a time.